There's this strange stretch of time in the early 1990s where the video game industry kind of loses its way. Up until then, things were simple. You had a console, a controller, a cartridge, and you played a game, and that was it. But then the CD-ROM showed up, and suddenly, everything changed. And this is the story of that era, when consoles tried to become entertainment systems, when pixelated sprites became polygons, and cartridges were replaced by CD-ROMs. And several different manufacturers wanted a piece of the pie, just like the early days of the video game industry. This is the story of the obscure consoles of the 1990s. Picture this, it's 1991. CDs are the future, computers are getting more powerful, and the dream is someday, everything in your living room will be interconnected. Your music, games, and movies, all in one component underneath your TV. Now imagine a company that actually tried to build that. Not in 2005 or 2010, but in 1991. That system was the Commodore CDTV, and on paper, it sounded like the future, but in reality, it became one of the biggest misfires in gaming and computing history. But here's the twist. The CDTV wasn't really a failure, although it was, but it was just ahead of its time and completely misunderstood. Now, to understand the CDTV, we need to talk about Commodore itself, because in the late 1980s, they were kind of in a weird place. On one hand, you had the Commodore 64, one of the best-selling computers of all time, but sales were starting to slump. And on the other hand, you had the Amiga. And the Amiga was special. We're talking advanced graphics, incredible sound, and true multitasking. It was years ahead of the competition. But Commodore had a problem. They didn't know how to market it. Was it actually the successor to the Commodore 64? Was it a gaming machine, a business computer, or a creative workstation? The answer to all was yes. And that confusion is exactly what would come back to haunt the CDTV. Now let's shift gears, because around 1990 there was a new buzzword in tech, the CD-ROM. And this wasn't just a small upgrade, this was a massive leap. Compared to floppy disk, they had way more storage, could produce better audio, CD quality audio, and had the possibility of doing full motion video. And suddenly, this had developers dreaming big. Interactive movies, digital encyclopedias, multimedia experiences, and companies started asking, could machines like this replace everything? And Commodore, they saw an opportunity. So Commodore takes the Amiga 500 and decides to reinvent it, not as a computer, but as something new, something futuristic, and they called it Dynamic Total Vision. And yeah, that's a very 90s name. The idea was simple. Take powerful computer hardware, hide it inside a sleek living room friendly, almost AV looking box, and then sell it as a premium entertainment device. And visually, they nailed it. The CDTV looks like a high-end piece of stereo equipment. The very 90s black finish, the clean lines, the front-loading CD tray, and a remote control to control the whole thing. Inside, you've got a Motorola 68000 CPU, 1 megabyte of RAM, and the standard Amiga OCS chipset. So essentially, this is an Amiga 500 with a CD-ROM drive. But here's where it gets weird. Out of the box, you didn't get a keyboard, a mouse, or even a proper controller. All you really got was the CDTV and a remote control. Now, let's just kind of think about that for a minute. They expected you to use a computer or a game console with a remote control. Now, sure, you could buy the keyboard, the floppy drive, and a mouse for the system, but those were all extra purchases. And once you did all that, it basically turned it back into a standard Amiga. But that wasn't really the biggest issue with this device. The biggest issue was the price. starting at $999. And in 1991, that was not just expensive, it was painful for the consumer. And here's the issue. For that price, the consumer had choices. Instead, they could buy a full-blown computer, or a console and a CD player, or upgrade their existing setups. So the CDTV lands in an awkward space here. It was too expensive for gamers, too limited for computer users, and too confusing for pretty much everyone else. Now let's go ahead and dig into the software for the system, because this is where the CDTV really struggled. Because yes, there were games, and some familiar ones at that as well, like Lemmings and SimCity and Battle Chess. But here's the problem. Most of these were just Amiga games copied onto a CD. Very few titles actually used the CD format in meaningful ways, and instead of focusing on games, Commodore leaned heavily into multimedia titles, things like encyclopedias, educational software, and interactive experiences. Now, that all sounds cool, but in practice, it wasn't what people wanted. And meanwhile, the competition wasn't just standing still. You had Sega dominating with the Genesis, Nintendo about to launch the SNES, and Philips pushing the CDI. And eventually, the 3DO entered the scene. Now sure, some of those also struggled, but at least they had a clear identity. And the CDTV was stuck in the middle. And then we get to the biggest issue of all, the marketing. Commodore made a critical mistake. They hid the Amiga name. Now think about that. They had one of the most respected computer brands of the time, and they chose not to use it. So instead of saying, hey, look at this new powerful Amiga with new capabilities, they said, here's this mysterious black box, and consumers responded with, okay, but what the hell is it? And the results? Poor sales. Very poor sales. Estimates suggest that fewer than 60,000 units ever sold. And just like that, the CDTV quietly faded away. The system only lasted a couple years on the market and was discontinued in 1993. The story of the FM Towns Marty starts in the early 1980s in Japan. During this time, several major computing manufacturers were competing in the 8-bit computing market. A couple of these companies were NEC and Fujitsu. In 1981, NEC had released the PC-88, a Z80 compatible 8-bit computer. Then in 1982, Fujitsu released the FM7 8-bit computer to compete with NEC. It was a Motorola 6809 based computer. There were other competitors in the Japanese market, such as Sharp's X1 and the MSX computer line. Amongst all the competition, NEC and Fujitsu gained a huge chunk in the professional, educational, and home computing markets. By late 1982, NEC had released the PC 9800 series. These were based off the Intel 8086 architecture, essentially IBM PC clones that were capable of running MS-DOS. To keep up, Fujitsu released the FMR series of computers in 1986. These were also x86 based computers capable of running MS-DOS and were popular in the office and professional market, being able to run software like Lotus 123, WordStar, and DBase. By the late 1980s, NEC had tried something different and it released its first video game console, the PC Engine. Fujitsu needed to stay up with competition. They had seen NEC starting to dabble in video games, and computers like Commodore's Amiga and Atari's ST were becoming very popular in the market. Not only were these machines powerful, but they had great graphics, excellent sound, had multitasking, and were multimedia capable as well. Now, multimedia was a new term in the late 1980s, and everybody wanted to jump on board and be able to watch videos, listen to music, play games, and eventually even surf the web on just one device. Fujitsu saw this and started development of their own multimedia computer. During its development, Fujitsu liked to codename their products after Nobel Prize winners. They decided to codename this product Towns after Charles Towns, the Nobel Prize winner of 1964 in physics. This new model of computer would run the Intel 386SX processor at 16 MHz and have 1 or 2 MB of RAM, expandable up to 6 MB. Although it didn't come with a hard drive, one could be installed using a SCSI card. Fujitsu decided to stick with the codename Towns and name the new model the Fujitsu Microcomputer Towns, or better known as the FM Towns. It released in 1989. Several models of the FM Towns were made through the years, starting with the first-gen original gray towers, the Model 1 and the Model 2. These eventually evolved into the CX series, along with the all-in-one UX series in 1991. And in 1992, a desktop version, the HG series, premiered, along with another all-in-one version, the UG series. All these computers were 386 based and were MS-DOS compatible. However, the FM Towns had its own graphical user interface operating system called Towns OS. This OS was pretty impressive during its time, and being based off MS-DOS like Windows 3.0, the FM Towns had attracted a lot of game developers, and a lot of great games were made for the system, from ports to exclusives. By 1992, Fujitsu had seen NEC enter the gaming market in Japan and abroad, and the success it was having. Then Commodore had released the CDTV, a multimedia-based Amiga computer. So they decided why not take a shot and started to design their own multimedia gaming platform. The design would be based off the 386SX with 2 megabytes of RAM, a CD-ROM drive, and a floppy drive. It would also be backward compatible with older FM Towns software, giving it a huge library of games to start off with. A 5-button D-pad controller with a select, run, A, B, and shoulder button for changing screen resolution and display modes was made for the system too. You could also connect a keyboard and a mouse to the system while loading Towns OS on the built-in floppy drive to have a computer right in your living room. In essence, they just cost-reduced the FM Towns base model computer into a gaming platform, but I must admit, the design cues of the console are a work of art. I mean, look at it, it's kind of a beautiful console. The FM Towns released in February of 1993, only in Japan. The name of the console remains a mystery. Some claim that the name derives from the popularity of Back to the Future and Marty McFly, but this has never been proven. Others claim that the name is just a fun Western name to show it was a fun console. But others have said that it's a play on words regarding the Sega Mega Drive. I'll leave it up to you guys to decide. Regardless, the console released to not much fanfare, and it was seen as the lesser model of the FM Towns computer with no ability for expansion and no hard drive. Sales were slow but steady, and by December of 1993, the system had sold around 45,000 units. Shortly after this, Fujitsu announced that they would be releasing the FM Towns Marty 2, but they had never divulged any technical specs on the console. The media and the public speculated that the console would have the 486SX running at least 20 MHz like the new UR series of FM Town computers. The Marty 2 released later in 1994 and featured a darker shell and cheaper price, but that was about it. There really was no differences at all between the Marty 1 and the Marty 2. Also in 1994, they released the FM Towns Car Marty, an even smaller form factor portable Marty that you could take with you on the go. Designed to connect to TVs and Japanese luxury cars like the Toyota Century. Sales of the system actually increased after the release of the cheaper Marty 2. The Marty had found a small niche market of dedicated followers, but the writing was on the wall for the computer-turned-console concept. It had never really been a success for Fujitsu, just like other companies before had tried it, like Atari with the 5200 and the XEGS, and Commodore with the CDTV, CD32, and the C64GS. Fujitsu was losing money on the Marty, and it was time to pull the plug. In 1995, the Marty was discontinued. However, the Marty does hold its place in history, as it was the world's first 32-bit game console to be released. The Commodore CD32, another early 32-bit game console, didn't release until 7 months later in September of 1993. Sales numbers of the system are questionable. Sources I've read state both the Marty 1 and 2 combined sold about 55 to 65,000 units in total in its short 2-year lifespan. Although the Marty really didn't gain traction, it was a very capable gaming platform with some great titles from well-known publishers. However, a lot of the games from the FM Towns library were not compatible with the Marty. Most of the incompatibility came from only having 2 megabytes of RAM. A lot of the games required 4 megabytes or more to just run. Another issue, the video display incompatibilities were really an issue too. The FM Towns games were designed to run on an RGB monitor and not over composite or S-video. When starting games, you have to manually configure the display setting each time you just want to play the game. This frustrated users of the system. And the nail in the coffin, in my opinion, was the release of the Marty 2 and all the hype behind it, just for the same system in a different color shell. The public was expecting upgrades and expandability, but that just wasn't the case, and this lost consumer confidence in the product. I mean, sales of the system did increase for a little while after the Marty 2's release, just because of the cheaper price, but those sales tanked after just a couple of months. Well, that brings us to the end of the FM Towns Marty story. Although the console was discontinued, the computer lived on with several different models being made. The last FM Towns computer was the HC series running a Pentium 90 MHz processor with 8 megabytes of onboard RAM, expandable up to 136 megabytes. Although these were the most powerful FM Towns computers, they were also the closest to PC clones and had lost much of their FM Towns identity, being specifically designed for MS-DOS and Windows. And that brings us to the end, as the FM Towns computer line was discontinued in 1997 as Fujitsu focused their computing business model on laptops. Did you ever realize that some of the most interesting gaming hardware ever made wasn't even built for gamers? It was built for kids, really young kids. And in the mid-1990s, right when the console wars were heating up, when Sega was battling Nintendo and Sony for dominance, they quietly released something completely different. They weren't making a successor to the Genesis, nor were they making a console to be an arcade powerhouse. But they were making something completely different, a storybook that was also a game console. This is the story of the Sega Pico. Now, to understand the Pico, you have to understand where Sega was in the early 1990s. At the time, Sega was riding high on the success of the Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive outside of the United States. They had the momentum, the attitude, and a little hedgehog named Sonic. But they also had a problem. Nintendo still dominated younger audiences with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and more importantly, they owned the family-friendly image. So Sega started thinking differently. Instead of competing head-on, what if they expanded the audience entirely? Enter the concept edutainment. This wasn't new to companies like VTech and Leapfrog that were already exploring the idea. But Sega wanted to bring console-quality hardware into that space. The Pico wasn't just a side project. It came from Sega's internal hardware teams, the same ecosystem that helped produce the Genesis. Internally, Sega saw something different that others didn't. Kids weren't just watching cartoons, they were interacting with media. So what if a book could become a controller? At first glance, the Sega Pico doesn't look like a console. It looks like a toy laptop, with its bright colors, chunky plastic, and big friendly buttons that just attracted kids to it. But if you open the thing up, you would find something absolutely unique. The Pico combines 3 things: a cartridge-based console, a physical storybook, and a stylus-based input system. Each game came as a storyware book. You'd insert the cartridge, open the book, and as you turned the pages, the game changed. But internally, the Pico is essentially a cut-down Sega Genesis. It ran off the Motorola 68000 CPU, the same as the Genesis had. Graphics were similar in architecture but simplified, and the sound was basic compared to the full Genesis hardware. So it wasn't as powerful, but it did what it needed to do. Additional hardware was needed to make the concept work. So Sega included a touch-sensitive pad, a stylus called a magic pen, and page sensors that detected page turns. This created a hybrid experience, part video game, part interactive book. Games weren't about reflexes, they were about drawing, matching, story interaction, and learning basics like numbers and letters. The Pico might not have gotten the spotlight, but its DNA is everywhere. I mean, think about it. tablets for kids, touchscreen learning apps, interactive books, even devices like the LeapPad that followed the same blueprints as the Pico. But Sega being Sega, they were just early to the game, really early. The Sega Pico wasn't trying to win the console wars. It wasn't even trying to beat Nintendo. It was trying to create something very, very new. And in a lot of ways, it did just that. But it did it very quietly. Have you ever heard about a gaming console so ambitious, so expensive, and so completely ahead of its time that it basically had no chance of succeeding? Today, we're diving into one of the strangest pieces of gaming hardware ever made, the Pioneer LaserActive. This wasn't just a console. It wasn't just a Laserdisc player. It was supposed to be the future of home entertainment. Games, movies, karaoke, interactive experiences, all in one machine. But there was just one problem. It cost more than most people's monthly rent or mortgage payments at the time. Now, to truly understand the LaserActive, we need to go back into time when companies thought that the Laserdisc was going to take over the world. And leading that charge was the Pioneer Corporation. They were a high-end consumer electronics company, producing stereos, Laserdisc players, and premium AV gear. And in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Laserdisc was their baby. Better quality than VHS, higher fidelity audio, and also way, way more expensive. Meanwhile, the gaming industry was exploding. Companies like Sega and NEC were pushing boundaries with CD-based gaming. So Pioneer had this idea. What if we combine Laserdisc with gaming? Not just games on discs, but fully interactive video experiences. Something like that felt like the future. Before LaserActive, Laserdisc games already existed. Arcades were already experimenting with it in the early 1980s. The most famous example? Dragon's Lair, created by Don Bluth. It looked like a playable cartoon, but here's the truth. It wasn't really a game in the traditional sense. The game didn't really have interaction, but was based on quick time movements with the joystick to continue on. Still, it blew people's minds, and companies thought, this is it, this is the future of gaming. So Pioneer decided to take that idea and bring it into your living room. Let's talk about the machine itself, because this thing is insane. At its core, the LaserActive is a high-end Laserdisc player, but it's modular, and that's where things get interesting. Instead of building a single console, Pioneer created something like a platform. You had the base unit, and then you had these things called packs, which stood for Pioneer Add-on Components. You want to play a Sega Genesis game? You needed the Mega LD pack. You wanted to play NEC PC Engine games? You needed the LD-ROM 2-pack. Each pack basically turned the system into a different console. The Sega pack made it compatible with Sega Genesis and Sega CD games, while the NEC pack gave you compatibility with the PC Engine and TurboGrafx and their CD support as well. But here's the kicker. These packs weren't very cheap, not even close. Let's break that down. The base LaserActive unit launched at about $970 in 1993. That's just for the player. Now, you wanted to actually play games? Each pack costs another $500 to $600. So if you wanted the full experience, you were looking to pay close to $2,000 in 1993. That's like buying a high-end gaming PC today. Meanwhile, a Super Nintendo Entertainment System cost about $200 and a Genesis was even cheaper by that point. So yeah, this thing was dead on arrival for most people. Now let's talk about the games, because this is where things get really weird. LaserActive had its own exclusive format, the LD-ROM. These were Laserdiscs with both video and game data. And the experience, well, they were games at least. Some of the best LD-ROM games were Triad Stone, Hyperion, and Space Berserker. A lot of these games relied heavily on full-motion video backgrounds, with gameplay layered on top. Some were shooters, some were interactive movies, and others were just strange. There were also karaoke discs, educational titles, and even music video experiences. So why did the LaserActive fail? There's a few big reasons for this. First, the price was just way too expensive. Second was timing. By the time this thing released, the CD-ROM was already taking over. Third was its limited game library and not enough killer apps. And fourth, it was just a confusing concept. Was it a movie player, a console? It confused the consumers, kind of like the Commodore CDTV did. And when people don't understand a product, they just don't buy it. The Pioneer LaserActive wasn't just a failure, it was a glimpse into an alternate future. A world where the Laserdisc became the dominant format. Today, it's a collector's dream, a bizarre, fascinating piece of gaming history, and a reminder that sometimes being ahead of your time is the same as being left behind. The story of the Amiga CD32 starts in the late 1970s at Atari. Nolan Bushnell had recently sold Atari to Warner Communication because of financial issues Atari was having at the time. Once Warner took over, the work culture at Atari had changed. Atari programmers were not getting the credit for the games they were making, and instead of developing the next game console, Atari used the technology that was supposed to be used in the latest console to develop their first computer. And this frustrated many folks that worked at Atari at the time. This is when Nolan Bushnell left Atari. Jay Miner, who had helped develop the technology that was supposed to go in the next game console, wanted to create another console using the Motorola 68000 CPU. Atari nixed the idea, and this is when Miner left Atari as well. Also around this time, several programmers left Atari. A few went off to form a new game company named Activision. These programmers were David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead. Larry Kaplan worked to get investors on the new computer project. He hired Miner, who had been out of the industry for a couple years, and started a new company called High Toro. High Toro was established in 1982 with David Morse as CEO and with Kaplan and Miner working on development. Initially, they started the company to create a new game system. This game system would be based on the Motorola 68000 CPU and was being built on breadboards. It was codenamed the Lorraine, named after David Morse's wife, Lorraine. Shortly after that, Kaplan was contacted by Nolan Bushnell. Bushnell convinced him to leave High Toro and come with him to develop a new system, as it would be better financially for him. Kaplan agreed and left High Toro, which proved to be a bad decision. In Kaplan's own words, Bushnell flaked out on their deal and it never happened. Meanwhile, over at High Toro, Miner was promoted to lead engineer and started working with R.J. Mickle and Dale Luck to finish the Lorraine. It was also at this time that the company's name was changed from High Toro to Amiga. By late 1983, the prototype was finished. Although the IC dies were still not developed, the system ran off several breadboards with discrete logic components making up what would soon be Amiga's custom chips. But all this came at a price, and Amiga was losing money fast. In January of 1984, two important things happened. Jack Tramiel resigned at Commodore, and the Lorraine would be demoed at the CES show. Amiga still hadn't developed much software for it. In fact, the system didn't even have an operating system or BIOS yet. But what it did have was one amazing program. We all know it as Boing, the bouncing ball, which later became the logo for Amiga. Patrons attending the show were amazed by the graphics of the 3D animated ball. Some even accused the Amiga team of hooking a different computer up to it to accomplish what they were seeing. This is when Atari saw the Lorraine and wanted to develop their next-gen game console from the technology. Amiga and Atari had even started development of a game console named the 1850 XLD. Then the video game crash of North America started in full swing. Atari lost over $1 million in 1 week and Warner Communications won it out. So talks and development with Amiga came to a standstill, all the while Amiga was on the brink of bankruptcy. In June of '84, Jack Tramiel bought Atari. During his brief time between this and Commodore, he started Tramiel Technology. He recruited most of the high-ranking engineers from Commodore to come along with him. They had started development on their own 68,000 base computer, but the Lorraine was further along. Jack knew Amiga was on the brink of bankruptcy and knew they were desperate and it was time to make his move. Atari gave Amiga a 1-month loan of $500,000 to keep Amiga afloat. If they didn't pay it back, Atari would acquire all the rights to the Lorraine technology, basically putting Amiga out of business. For Amiga, this gave them 1 more month to find an investor before Atari took it all. Now over at Commodore, Irving Gould now ruled everything. He put Marshall F. Smith as CEO of Commodore. Commodore at this time was hurting for engineers because most had left the company to join Jack at Atari, so they needed a new computer. Talks between Commodore and Amiga started. First, Commodore offered Amiga just a licensing agreement worth $4 million, but soon changed it to an outright buying of Amiga for $24 million. Amiga agreed to this, and Amiga became a subsidiary of Commodore. By late 1984, the breadboards from the Lorraine became the Amiga's custom chips such as the Agnes, Denise, and Paula, which is known as the OCS or Original Chipset. In 1985, the Amiga, or later known as the Amiga 1000, was launched. 2 years later, the most successful Amigas were launched, the Amiga 500 and the Amiga 2000, both using the OCS. Now from here on, I'm really going to hit the fast forward button. Sorry Amiga fans, I'm not going to go through every Amiga computer, but let me explain to the folks out there that from 1987 to 1992, 2 more chipsets were introduced to the Amiga. The enhanced chipset, which improved screen resolution and other video improvements. Then later, starting with the Amiga 4000, the Advanced Graphics Architecture, or AGA, was introduced, a true 32-bit graphical chipset. Now, continuing with the fast forwarding, by 1993, as a whole, Commodore was just hurting financially. Irving Gould was running the company into the ground, and sales of all the Amiga models were low, and sales of the outdated Commodore 64 was almost nothing. The company at this point had been through several CEOs since Jack's departure. Things were looking bleak. But there might be a silver lining, making the Amiga do what the Amiga was designed to do, be a game console. Commodore had tried this in the past a couple of times with the Commodore 64 game system, which was just an absolute failure, and then with the Amiga CD-TV, which wasn't very successful either. But things were different this time. This was a true 32-bit CD game system in 1992, right during the height of the 5th gen CD-ROM craze. Commodore was literally banking on this to keep the company going. They started to design the prototype, codenamed Spellbound. Really, it was just a consoleized Amiga 1200 with a CD-ROM running the AGA chipset, put into, dare I say, a pretty nice looking case, with design cues of the Sega Genesis. Then right around this time, one of the worst things that could have happened to Commodore did. They got sued for patent infringement. Apparently, Commodore infringed on XOR's technology that used different parts of the display, such as the mouse pointer, menus, and dragging, and it also managed and controlled the memory for this. They went to US court and Commodore was ordered to pay $10 million. This couldn't have come at a worse time for Commodore. The CD32 was released on September 17, 1993 in the UK, and the rest of Europe shortly after. It was very successful due to the Amiga's popularity in Europe and its compatibility with other Amiga hardware and software. Things were actually looking pretty good for the system. Then later in September, Commodore demoed the CD32 at the World Amiga Show in Pasadena, California. They said that the unit would be shipped to some US cities by Christmas and have a full launch by January of 1994. However, time was not on Commodore's side. The deadline to pay off the $10 million debt was up, and now the US government put an injunction on Commodore that they could not do business in the United States until the debt was paid. Commodore had already produced thousands of consoles for the US and Canadian market, but the shipment was held up in the Philippines until a lawsuit and the debt to the Philippine console manufacturing plant and shippers was paid. In the European market, where the console was doing very well, Commodore could not keep up with the demand because there was a supply shortage of parts, and I'm assuming that's from all the parts that were used in the consoles for the US that were held up in the Philippines. This was the final nail in the coffin for Commodore. By April of 1994, they declared bankruptcy and all Commodore products were discontinued, even the CD32. But this isn't the end of the CD32 story. After Commodore dissolved, several companies bought the Amiga CD32s that were held up. Some were used in museums for information display units. One of the more popular uses was by an Italian company named CD Express. They created an arcade cabinet built around the Amiga CD32 called the Cubo CD32. Just a few games were made, most of which were puzzle games. Also, some Amiga CD32 motherboards were known to run slot and video poker machines from the early 2000s. Well, that brings us to the end of the CD32 story, a sad ending to a once great company, a good example of what poor management can do. Although the CD32 isn't well known in the US, it was very successful in Europe, selling over 125,000 units in its short 7-month lifespan, and being the last product Commodore made. In the early 1990s, the video game industry was changing fast. Companies were experimenting with CD-ROM technology, full motion video, and the idea that games could be more like movies. Some of those experiments worked, but most didn't. And then there was the Bandai Playdia, a system so strange, so limited, that many people don't even consider it a real game console. No traditional controller, no real gameplay, and a library filled with interactive anime episodes instead of games. So what exactly was the Playdia? Why did Bandai create it, and how did it end up becoming one of the most obscure and misunderstood systems of the 1990s? To understand the Playdia, we need to understand Bandai. Bandai wasn't originally a video game company. They were a toy giant, one of the biggest in Japan. They made plastic models, action figures, and licensed merchandise for major anime franchises like Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, and Mobile Suit Gundam. By the early 1990s, Bandai saw something important. Kids weren't just playing with toys anymore. They were playing with video games, and more importantly, they were watching anime on home video. So Bandai had an idea. What if they could combine animation and interactivity and their toy licenses all into one product? The Playdia didn't come out of nowhere. It was born during one of the weirdest eras in gaming history, the multimedia CD-ROM boom. This was the era of the Philips CDI, the 3DO, and the Sega CD, where everyone believed CDs were the future. Why? Because CDs could store full motion video, high quality audio, and large amounts of data. The dream was simple. Games would become interactive movies. But there was a problem. The technology really wasn't ready. Video was heavily compressed. Gameplay was limited. And most interactive experiences were barely interactive at all. Bandai looked at this trend and didn't try to compete with traditional gaming. Instead, they leaned all the way into the interactive anime concept. So what exactly is the Playdia? Released in 1994 in Japan, the Playdia was marketed not as a hardcore gaming system, but as a family-friendly multimedia machine for children. And right away, you can tell something was different. Because instead of a controller, you got a wireless infrared remote control. No D-pad, no joystick, just the remote control with its buttons. This alone tells you everything you need to know about the system. This wasn't designed for action games, it was designed for watching and occasionally interacting. So let's talk about what's inside the Playdia. It's surprisingly simple. It's basically a CD-ROM, basic video playback hardware, and a limited CPU. No advanced GPU, no real 3D capabilities. In fact, compared to systems like the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, it's not even in the same league. Those systems were pushing polygons, while the Playdia was pushing cartoons. Today, the Bandai Playdia is a curiosity, a footnote in gaming history, but also a reminder that not every idea has to succeed. It just has to be interesting. Back in the mid-1990s, the video game industry was a strange place. Sony had just entered the scene with the PlayStation. Sega was transitioning from the 32X to the Sega Saturn into the 3D realm as well. And Nintendo, well, they were preparing to leap into the Nintendo 64. Everyone was chasing power and 3D polygon graphics, but one company went in a completely different direction. A company better known for calculators and keyboards, and that was Casio. They decided to make a video game console, but not just any video game console. A console aimed almost exclusively at young girls. A first of its kind with a built-in printer, but only had about 10 games. This is the story of the Casio Loopy. To understand the Casio Loopy, you really have to understand Casio itself. Founded in 1946, Casio built its reputation on practical electronic calculators, watches, and musical instruments. By the 1980s and early 1990s, they were everywhere. But video games, that wasn't really their space. But they had experimented before. Systems like the Casio PV1000 in the early 1980s, and even MSX computers. But they were never really a major gaming player. So why make the jump now? Because the market was changing, and more importantly, it was expanding. By the early 1990s, gaming had a reputation problem. It was seen rightly or wrongly as a boy's hobby. Marketing from companies like Nintendo and Sega heavily skewed towards young male audiences. Explosions, action, sports, but Casio saw something others didn't. A massive underserved demographic, young girls. Instead of competing directly with Sony and Sega on power, Casio chose a different route. What if we made a console specifically for girls? That idea would shape everything about the Loopy. Unlike Nintendo or Sega, Casio didn't have a legendary game designer figure tied to the Loopy. Instead, the Loopy came out of corporate product planning teams inside of Casio. That's important, because the Loopy feels less like a gamer's console and more like a consumer electronics experiment. The Casio Loopy's defining feature was simple but bizarre. It had a built-in color thermal printer. Now, let that sink in here for a minute. While everyone else was pushing polygons, Casio was letting you print stickers. You could take images from game characters, scenes, decorations, and print them out as physical stickers. This wasn't just a gimmick, it was the entire point of the console, and honestly, it kinda makes sense. In the 1990s, scrapbooking was huge, sticker collecting was popular, and creative expression was largely offline. Casio essentially tried to merge gaming and crafts all together. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the hardware itself. The specs were really never talked about, but it did have a 32-bit CPU and focused mainly on 2D graphics, and of course its killer feature, the built-in thermal color printer. Now the controller, it was pretty simple, rounded, and approachable. Everything about the system screamed, this is not for hardcore gamers, and that was intentional. But unfortunately, this is where things kind of take a downhill approach. The Loopy launched in 1995 in Japan, and over its entire lifespan, it only received about 10 games. Most were centered around fashion, romance, life simulation, and creative tools, with titles like Dream Change and Little Romance. These weren't action games. They were more like interactive storybooks or creative sandboxes, with many of them leaning heavily into the printer feature that the console offered. You could design your own fashion and outfits and print them out. You could also print out your own characters and decorations. But here's the problem. The games lacked depth. Once the novelty wore off, there really wasn't much left. Now, as the Casio marketed the Loopy almost exclusively to young girls with bright colors and a friendly design, and while that sounds progressive, it also boxed the console into a very narrow audience. Instead of expanding gaming, it segmented it. The Casio Loopy quickly disappeared in the 1990s. Today, the Casio Loopy is remembered as a curiosity, a collector's item, and a fascinating piece of what-if video game history. But here's the thing, it really wasn't entirely wrong. Modern gaming embraces creativity, customization with like your avatars, and sharing. In a weird way, the Loopy was a little ahead of its time. It just didn't have the technology or the market to support the idea. Today we're talking about one of the rarest, strangest, and most misunderstood systems ever made, the Super A-Can. A console from Taiwan released in 1995, just years too late with almost no games and a price tag that practically guaranteed failure. But here's the thing, this story isn't about just a bad console, it's about ambition, bad timing, and a company that bet everything and lost. So let's go ahead and start with the company. The Super Akan was developed by FunTech Entertainment. Now chances are you've never heard of them, and honestly that's part of the story. FunTech wasn't a gaming giant like Nintendo or Sega, they were more of a general electronics manufacturer, dabbling in multimedia and consumer tech. But in the early 1990s, something big was happening. The video game industry was exploding, the 16-bit era was in full swing. You had the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Genesis, that were both dominating the market. And from the outside, it looked like a gold rush, so FunTech decided, why not us? The Super Akan wasn't just meant to be a gaming console. FunTech envisioned it as a multimedia system. And this is important, because in the mid-1990s, multimedia was the buzzword. Companies everywhere were trying to create an all-in-one entertainment device. Think of systems like the Philips CDI or the 3DO. The idea was simple. Games, music, video, and education, all in one box. The Super Akan followed that same philosophy. It even had plans for karaoke support, educational software, and video playback. But here's where things start to go wrong. The hardware they built was already outdated. Alright, so let's go ahead and pop open the hood, because this is where things get a little bit confusing. At its core, the Super Akan used a 16-bit architecture, but there was a problem. It launched in 1995. By that point, the industry was already moving on to the 32-bit systems. We're talking systems like the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. So right out of the gate, the Super Akan was way behind the times. It had the Motorola 68000 CPU similar to what was in the Sega Genesis. It had a custom graphics chip, and it had cartridge-based games. Now that last one, that was a huge deal, because by 1995, the industry was shifting hard towards CD-ROMs. Why? They were cheaper to produce, had more storage, and were able to produce full-motion video. Meanwhile, the Super Akan was stuck with cartridges, which were expensive and limiting. Now, let's talk about the games, because ultimately a console lives or dies by its library, and the Super Akan, well, it barely had one. Only about 12 games were ever released for the system. Some of the more notable titles included Sango Fighter, Speedy Dragon, and Gambling Lord. These were mostly developed by Taiwanese studios, and while some were technically competent, none of them were system sellers. There was no Mario, no Sonic, no Street Fighter, no Mortal Kombat, nothing that made people say, hey, I need to get this console. The Super Akan launched primarily in Taiwan with limited distribution in other parts of Asia. There was talk of expanding globally, but that never really happened. And pricing, this is where it gets brutal. At launch, the Super Akan cost roughly $300 in equivalent. And at that price point, it was in direct competition with the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Except, those systems were far more powerful, had massive gaming libraries, had huge development support. So, from a consumer perspective, why would you choose the Super Akan? And this is where everything falls apart. The Super Akan launched in 1995 and failed almost immediately. Poor sales, no developer support, no killer apps, and within a year, FunTech pulled the plug, and the losses? They were just massive. The company reportedly lost millions of dollars on the project, so what did they do? They exited the console market entirely. Today, the Super Akan is incredibly rare. Collectors love it, not because it was great, but because it represents a moment in time, a moment when anyone thought that they could break into the console market, and most of them, well, they failed. But that's what makes retro gaming so fascinating. It's not just about the hits, it's about the misses too. The weird ideas and the forgotten systems, and the companies that took a shot, even when all the odds were stacked against them. The story of the Pippin video game system starts in the early 1990s. By then, Apple's market share in the computer business was starting to fade rapidly. With the introduction of the Macintosh in 1984 and its continued line of computers, sales were slumping, and with the planned discontinuation of their biggest moneymaker, the Apple II line, Apple had to come up with a way to expand in the market. They started to think about the possibility of licensed clones of the Macintosh that third parties would produce to try to expand their market share, just like IBM did with the PC. By 1993, Bandai, a toy and game company, wanted to create a new CD-ROM-based next-generation video game console. Bandai had been in the video game market since the early 1980s with limited success. They licensed the rights from Emerson to make the Bandai Arcadia, a clone of the Emerson Arcadia 2001 console in 1982. They also made some games for the Nintendo Famicom and NES through the 1980s. Bandai had heard that Apple was looking to license the Macintosh, and they wanted to make a game system using Mac architecture. In 1994, Bandai met with Apple and came up with the prototype design of a new multimedia video game system based off the Macintosh 2 classic hardware. It would have the same 16 MHz Motorola 68030 CPU and ran Macintosh system software. Apple would handle the design of the logic board, and Bandai would produce the system shell, packaging, and handle the console's marketing. During the development, Apple and Bandai had asked customers what they wanted in a multimedia game system, and overwhelmingly the response was access to the internet. Bandai never intended on having internet connectivity, but Apple was insistent that the Pippin have it. A couple years earlier, Apple had moved away from the standard serial connection with a modem for internet. They now use GeoPort, which used software to emulate the modem to connect to the internet. But to use this technology, the system had to be completely redesigned due to hardware constraints of the 68030 CPU. Apple decided to go with the PowerPC architecture like their current Macs were running. They chose the brand new PowerPC 603 32-bit CPU. Unlike most video game systems, the Pippin would not have a dedicated GPU or sound chip. 2D and 3D graphics were rendered by QuickDraw. Apple had advised third parties to develop 3D rendering hardware for the system if needed. Video for the system is only supported by QuickTime and has no MPEG codec support. In December of 1994, Apple officially announced the Pippin system and their partnership with Bandai. Bandai had planned on launching the console in mid-1995, but unfortunately, the launch date was pushed back to 1996 due to production and development issues. In October of 1995, Mitsubishi Electric agreed to help with production of the console, but never became an official licensee with Apple. In March of 1996, the Bandai Pippin Atmark went on sale in Japan at the cost of 64,800 yen. It included a dial-up modem and 4 bundled games. Bandai CEO Makoto Yamanashi stated at the time he thought over 200,000 units would sell by the end of the year. Bandai had spent over $93 million marketing the console in Japan with no help from Apple. Then in June of 1996, the Bandai Pippin At-World was released in the US at a cost of $599. It came bundled with a 6-month unlimited internet account from PSI Net that cost $24.95 per month. Also in June of 1996, a Norwegian company called Cats Media signed a license agreement with Apple to produce the Pippin system. They also signed an agreement with Bandai to produce the hardware for the Cats. Bandai would concentrate its efforts in Japan and the US, while Cats would focus on Europe and Canada. While Bandai marketed the system as a game console, Cats wanted to market it as a multimedia device. They initially wanted to produce 2 systems, the first one just a basic machine capable of running only CD-ROMs, while the other more expensive unit would have internet connectivity. But only one unit was produced. It was named the Cats Media Player 2000. It was available in 2 configurations, one with a rear SCSI port to connect a SCSI device such as a hard drive or floppy drive. The other model did not have the SCSI port. Cats Media never sold the product in the retail market. It attempted to sell it as a set-top box to its media partners such as cable companies and catalogs. Not very many of these were made or sold, which makes the Cats Media Player one of the most rare examples of the Pippin. There were around 60 games made in total for the system, most of which were puzzle and edutainment games. There were also non-game related software made for the system, such as a how-to home improvement CD-ROM and internet browsers. Most of the software development came in-house from Bandai, but there were some third-party developers for the system, but most were small indie developers. This meant the Pippin really had no third-party support like the bigger game companies like Nintendo, Sega, and Sony. This made it increasingly difficult for the Pippin to compete. Also, people complained of the cost of the Pippin compared to the other consoles of the time, and sales never really took off. By 1997, Bandai was losing money fast and had decided to cancel the Pippin at World in the US due to almost non-existent sales. They sent the unsold units back to Japan to be sold there. Also around this time, Bandai started merger talks with Sega as financially things were looking bleak. Things were not looking good for the Pippin. The unit had been canceled in the US, had slow sales, had unknown publishers making games for it, lacked the 3D power of the Saturn, PlayStation, and N64. The writing was on the wall for Bandai, and unfortunately for them, the merger with Sega did not go through. Then Steve Jobs came back to Apple. When Jobs was at Apple before, he wanted closed systems, and upon his return, it was no different. He canceled all agreements with companies making Mac clones, including the Pippin. By mid-1997, production of the Pippin had stopped, and the system was all but canceled. Katz Media said they would continue to support the Pippin, which it did until its eventual bankruptcy in 1998. Bandai supported the console until December 31, 2002. The Apple Pippin had a 2-year lifespan, from 1996 to 1997. It was Apple's only venture into the gaming market. It sold just over 42,000 units worldwide, making it one of the worst-selling consoles of all time.